My name is David Iglesias, and I have the honor and the pleasure of directing the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics, and we've got an amazing presentation this evening. I can thank Scott Baker, who is seated to the your far right, for putting this idea in my mind a few months ago. I think if you're like me, you probably have never met, or maybe you have met, a speechwriter. I've only known two in my entire life. One was Michael Gerson. I didn't know him very well. These gentlemen knew him a lot better. And Pete Wehner. Pete was going to be here tonight. He's going to explain in the video we're going to play in a second why he can't make it, but he's sick, and he wants to be here, but he's being responsible. So why don't I do this? Why don't I do the introductions, and then we'll start off with Pete. I want to acknowledge Michael's family who are here somewhere. Don and his brothers, Chris and Vic, and Tara is the sister-in-law. So thank you so much for making the effort of coming back to Wheaton College. So let me introduce our video speaker, Pete Wehner. He's a fellow at the Trinity Forum, a nonprofit Christian organization in Washington, D.C. He's a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, contributing editor for The Atlantic, and author of The Death of Politics, rather. If you love writing, stand by for some great writers. Pete Wehner earned his degree from the University of Washington. He served in 3 Republican administrations: the Reagan administration, the H.W. Bush administration, and the George W. Bush administration. He was also a speechwriter for the Secretary of Education, William Bennett. David Brooks, seated in the center here, is actually was born in Canada. I didn't know that, Dave. Why is it that Canadians do so well in this country? Maybe because they left when they were young. But he's a political and cultural commentator who writes for the New York Times. He's been a film critic for the Washington Times, an op-ed editor for the Wall Street Journal, a senior editor at the Weekly Standard. He's the writer's writer, folks. He's written a ton of books, which I will not name, since we will not be having a book signing, sadly, for you. But you have visited Wheaton College before, I believe. His wife is a Wheaton grad, so I don't know if Ann's here or not, but thank you for coming. Yeah. And last but not least is Scott Baker. He's been an American political commentator, a television news anchor. So those stereotypes you've seen in Bruce Almighty, put those away, because he's the real deal. He's a serious operator. He worked as a news anchor for 13 years in Pittsburgh for WTAE, and he co-founded The Blaze, serving as editor-in-chief for 6 years. He received his political science degree from Wheaton College, 1986, if memory serves me. Is that correct?
I was in the class of 86, but I didn't get out until 87, so don't let that.
Close enough. He graduated in the mid-1980s. He worked full-time for the Reagan-Bush campaign. He was later the state president of the Illinois College Republicans. I have to tell you, I've been to a lot of funerals and a lot of services that commemorate people, but I've never laughed as hard as hearing Scott's stories about Michael Gerson from their Wheaton days, and I really hope he unveils some of those stories because they're marvelous. So without further ado, let's start the video.
Good evening. My name's Pete Wehner. It pains me that I can't be with you, as I very much planned to be, to celebrate the life of Michael Gerson. I tested positive for COVID, which makes my attendance impossible. I want to first thank Wheaton for hosting this event. It's a fitting tribute. Mike loved Wheaton. It's an institution that shaped his intellectual and spiritual life. He started his writing career at the Wheaton Record. His article on Mother Teresa got him his first job with Chuck Colson, and that altered the trajectory of his life. And Mike was immensely proud that Wheaton was founded by an ardent abolitionist. Mike did tell me once that when he attended Wheaton, the rules were no drinking and no dancing, neither of which affected his life in any way. I first met Mike in the mid-1990s. Almost instantaneously, he became a close confidant, an intellectual and spiritual companion, a colleague and co-author. My relationship with Mike was among the most cherished of my life. Mike was taken far too early from us. He was only 58 years old when he died, but in the time that he was given, he packed an enormous amount in. He attained excellence in two very different professions: journalism, including a syndicated column for the Washington Post, and government service, including as a key advisor on Capitol Hill and later in the White House. Not many people have reached the top rungs in their profession in one or the other. Mike is the only one I can think of who has achieved both, and he did so before he reached his mid-40s. Mike loved his time in journalism. He had a journalist's eye for detail, and he understood the power of narrative, and there was not a better writer in its ranks. But for him, nothing was comparable to working in the White House. There are many reasons why, including the close friendships he made and the president he came to love. But the main reason was that he had the ability not just to comment on matters, but to shape the outcome of events. Most important in that category was Mike's vocal and extremely effective advocacy in 2003 to provide AIDS treatment and prevention to Africans on a massive scale. Because of that effort, the estimates are that it saved 25 million lives. It was a breathtaking act of mercy, among the greatest in American history, and Michael Gerson was central to it. Mike was a person of integrity. He wasn't perfect, and he'd be the first to say so, but he was utterly incorruptible. He was also the rarest of individuals, in which the greater his proximity to power, the more he felt solidarity with the powerless, the suffering, the unseen. Mike was a person of courage, too, including the courage to break with his party when he felt his conscience demanded it. In all of the various settings I was in with Mike, I never once saw him back down on a matter of principle or fail to speak out when speaking out was what his conscience required. But Mike is known, and understandably so, for his words, his incandescent words. Whether as a presidential speechwriter or a columnist or an essayist, Mike wrote like an angel. But the thing to understand about Mike is that the words were not mere words. He viewed them as a way to convey knowledge and wisdom, to deepen empathy and understanding, to advance justice and beauty, to call out injustice and cruelty, to search for and to find truth. In that sense, Mike's words were inseparable from the man. They reflected his moral commitments. But Christian faith was at the core of who Mike was. It wasn't compartmentalized. It touched every part of his life, like drops of food coloring in a water glass. Mike's views reflected a Christian anthropology, a belief in the inherent rights and dignity of every human life. His faith was capacious and generous. It created in him a deep commitment to justice and the common good. For some people, faith hardens them. It sharpens their edges. They become more judgmental, more arrogant, more unforgiving. But not in Mike's case. His faith made him more generous, more tender, more tolerant. He wrote about his faith so easily because he was so at ease with it. Of all the topics we talked about over the last quarter century, and there were a lot of them, my conversations with him about faith and all that flowed from faith are the ones I miss the most. Mike's last long essay for the Post, what some of us refer to as his Jesus of Nazareth essay, was an extraordinary feat of scholarship, and he wrote it despite a body riddled with cancer. It was a phenomenal achievement. Mike felt like the essay captured, even if imperfectly, the Jesus who had long ago captured his heart. When I asked him what he found most encouraging about the huge response to his essay, he told me all the people who find the Jesus of the Gospels so appealing. He added, "I feel like whenever I go, I have written the most important words I'm ever likely to write." I'll leave it to others to debate what the most important words Mike ever wrote were. All I can testify to is that for my part at least, I felt like my soul was knit to his. It was the gift of a lifetime. A person wrote to Mike shortly before he transitioned from life to life, saying, "You've been a voice for Jesus. Your homecoming will be amazing." Mike was an elegant, mighty voice for Jesus, and I know his homecoming was amazing. Rest well, brother. We'll see you again.
So I'm going to ask our guest a couple of questions. First is, when did you first meet Michael? I'll start off with you, Scott. And what was your first impression of him?
He was a total mess. His office was a disaster area. And I say it was in Traber, and they had a room across the hall from your room. And somehow he had taken over that room as his office. And a friend of ours had said, "You got to come meet this guy that just transferred from Georgetown." And so I wandered over there, and he had this black and white TV, and which he sometimes, I talked to one of our roommates today, he sometimes watched baseball. I don't really remember that. So I don't know if he really liked baseball or if he just was pretending to be George Will. I kind of think that was the case. But it was already at that point stacked with legal pads and books and things that were totally indecipherable. And I was sort of like, wow, this guy just got here, and this place looks like it's been disheveled for centuries.
So I take that was a positive impression?
Oh, definitely.
All right, thank you, Scott. David, your first impression, and how did you meet him?
Yeah, I too met at Wheaton. We had keggers.
That was it. Yeah.
We were part of the Jewish Hillel Club together.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to imagine when my first time my wife.
I don't think people do know it because Michael is part Jewish.
That's for sure. That's my basic rule. All the smartest Christians are Jews.
Sure.
Including the original one.
Well, my wife is technically 14% Ashkenazi Jew based on her 23andMe. So I'm going to now tell her what you've said.
Yeah. No, we didn't meet at Wheaton, sadly, though I wish I'd gone here. I went to, you're in Chicago, the Wheaton of the South Side. And I remember when my wife first gave me a tour of campus, she described all the scandalous behavior that happened here.
Clearly.
And I remember thinking, oh, is this where you and your boyfriend interdigitated? But I met Michael in the mid-'90s. He was working for Senator Dan Coates at the time. And what was striking about him is he introduced me to a term that had not been invented yet, which was compassionate conservatism.
Yeah.
And he really was the author and founder, and maybe the only member of compassionate conservatism. But he was working with Coates, with a bunch of people in the House and the Senate, to create an agenda that was Republican, that celebrated capitalism, but was also Christian. Mm-hmm. And that really was oriented toward the marginalized, the poor, and the least amongst us. And what's so amazing about him is that the first time I met him in the 90s, compassionate conservatism, that Christian social teaching, was at the center of what he did. Mm-hmm. And the last time I saw him, Christian social teaching was at the center of what he did.
Right.
His entire life was organized around one pillar of public philosophy, and it guided everything he did. And so an amazingly morally coherent life.
And that would include the PEPFAR, the Presidential Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, right? I think the acronym's correct.
That's correct.
How did you first hear about that? Because I remember hearing about it when I was in the Bush administration, but I was prosecuting bad guys and not thinking about AIDS relief. When you first heard that, did that shock you that it came from a Republican administration?
I sort of was aware of it coming up, and I guess early on, before PEPFAR happened, I went to Africa with Mike and two others, two other government officials, so the three of them and then me. And it was one of those striking trips where you go into hospitals in Africa and you're in AIDS wards and just people are dying left and right. Mm-hmm. And we went to a village, I think in Namibia, and there were grandparents and there were kids. There were no parents because that whole generation had been wiped out. And I remember going to a church that was just made out of trees, And the grandmas in the church were just trying to preach good behavior so you don't die. And I remember talking to a young woman in Mozambique, and I said, "Have you ever heard of any American?" And she said, "Yes, Usher." She'd heard of Usher. And then she has HIV positive, and I said, "How'd you get it?" And she said, "I bought it for airtime." And for those of us who've been on TV, I thought, airtime?
Airtime.
What? But it turns out if she would sleep with her teacher, he would give her a phone card.
Right.
And so she's basically losing her life for a phone card. And so it was just an emotionally very powerful trip. Made more powerful for me because we're in rural Mozambique and the 3 government officials get off on a plane and leave. And the journalist is like, "How do I get home?" So they left me. But I think I got home. But then took another trip 5 years later after PEPFAR. And instead of AIDS wards where people are just dying, it's like going to the CVS. They're handing out the ARVs, the drugs, and they're living.
Right.
It was one of the most, if not the most successful government program
Right.
I ever did. And I always say people, and Mike was very powerful on this subject. He used to say, if you think you don't care about politics, that's because you have the luxury of living in a society in which it's possible not to care about politics.
Wow.
And that he said eventually politics will care about you. And so he would preach, and I preached following on him, preach it to students. Politics is sometimes a messy business, but it can also be the most emotionally and morally rewarding thing you can possibly do and have the biggest impact you can possibly have.
Let me ask a question about David, and I wanted
Sure.
to give a little bit of a Wheaton setup to see how this might have even interacted with your conversations with Michael, because I'm actually here just to learn stuff from David.
So that was just your comic relief.
Well, right, yeah. Well, that's my main thing is I just wrote jokes for Mike's speeches, including, I was like, if people come up to him in the airport, if they're mad at him, and they're like, "Hey, you're that," "Yes, I'm David Brooks," and then he can just move along. When Michael and I, we in our junior year lived in an apartment with 2 other roommates, but one of our other roommates, Jordan Quick, was the rock star on campus. Like he was very popular. He was everybody knew Jordan. And a few years after we graduated, Jordan contracted AIDS. And I remember when he was first telling us about this, and then a couple of times Michael and I went to visit with him. I was thinking about this in particular because we had dinner before this at Adele's downtown, where the waiter spilled balsamic vinaigrette all over my hair. So I have this dark spot here. But the apartment across from Adele's is where Jordan lived after we graduated. And that was where, and I remember going over there with Michael to Jordan's apartment at one point where Jordan loved playing U2, and Michael hated it. And I was thinking, like, you don't even know what's going to happen. Like, if you were predicting, like, in the future that he'd be friends with Bono, or that you would even said, by the way, in 40 years, people look back and say that the policies you were involved in saved 25 million lives. It'd be hard to think about that while you're an undergraduate at a place like this. But watching what Jordan went through, and we went down, I remember once we went and visited Jordan in the hospital. Once I went to his home. I can't remember if Michael was there. And then I was not able to go to the funeral, but Michael was able to go to the funeral for Jordan. And Michael would often speak with a great passion about an issue or something that he had great moral conviction about. But he was sometimes reticent to talk about his own personal experiences or motivations around that. And part of what even when you look at what happened with PEPFAR was it wasn't just like, here's a policy, and Michael was sort of involved. The actual passage of that and the making possible of that was the introduction of the language that made it possible for people to come together, right? That you could create something where you might have had division, because it's not like people in the United States were clamoring for this legislation to be put forward or passed. And Michael was able to kind of provide the language for the president and make it possible for people on all sides of these issues to come together. So there were many people that were involved in making that happen, but Michael's role in that was not insignificant. I'm just wondering if on the trips or in other conversations you had, did he ever talk about the influence of Jordan's death so early on in the AIDS crisis? I have a feeling he didn't, but I think it was deeply personal, and I think it was a big motivating factor about why he took that issue so seriously so early.
Could be. I didn't know that story, yeah. No, that's interesting. He was, Dawn and his brothers can say, I would say they know obviously more than we do, but one thing about Michael, he was a very emotional guy, and my impression was he grew up, the family, his parents, that home was not emotionally out there. That's my impression. And so it was always a struggle where he was a guy who thought the heart really, the emotions are knowledge. The emotions, the heart really is the thing. The organ, where there's a guy, Jamie Smith, who teaches at Calvin, which is the Wheaton
What is that?
Grand
What
Rapids.
is that?
Calvin College, which is
I don't think I've heard of that school, have you?
It's a feeder school.
Yes.
Feeder school.
Minor leagues.
But, he says, we're not thinking creatures, we're desiring creatures. I don't know if Mike would have said it that way, but I think that's how he behaved. So he was not always, you couldn't, at least for me, didn't always know the source of the Nile with Michael.
Right. Yes. Right.
So Scott, I have a question for you. So you knew him when he was, 19, 20 years old?
Yeah, he was not a pure Wheatonite. He transferred from Georgetown.
From a Catholic school, right?
Yes, from Georgetown. Yeah, so he was studying to be in the Foreign Service at Georgetown, but then decided he wanted to take Bible and theology, and that's why he came to Wheaton.
Was there any indication, based on your time at Traber Dorm, that he would, be involved in saving 25 million people?
Well, you knew right away that he was going to be involved in something serious, right? Because there was not a trivial aspect to Michael in any way, shape, or form. I talked to our other roommate, John, who lived next door to him in Traber. I said, what was the first conversation? And he said, I asked him a simple question about taking Bible, and I got an hour lecture on transubstantiation. Like, yeah, that's pretty much it.
So his brothers told me over dinner that when he was a young boy, he would wear a suit to school with a tie, and he used a quill pen. Did you see any of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, he was an abuser of pens, I think, right? That would be I think every eulogist at the memorial at the National Cathedral mentioned that many pens died in the service of creating these great words. So yeah, so there was a formality, and I would say it was the great pleasure of my life. Really, was all my life. Really, I listened to Mike Gerson read me words out loud. Can I read you this? Can you hear this? Right? Did you get those calls where he'd be trying out a phrase, or he'd be trying it, and then you would just hear that echo in your head, like you would just come to hear it and love it. So that was part of the fortuitous nature of I've been in a season of serendipity. Some crazy things have happened in the last couple of months. And I was up in Matthew Milliner's office earlier today, and we were talking about some of these patterns. And I took off my junior year and worked in Washington, where I was from, and that's how I deepened a friendship with a guy named Ken Myers, who with Mars Hill Audio, many of you may know that. He had been the arts editor at NPR, and I went to high school with his sister. So when I was a teenager, he knew that 14-year-old Scott Baker really was interested in Francis Schaeffer, and Ken knew Francis Schaeffer, dragged me along when he would be doing interviews, and I got to know Schaeffer pretty well. In fact, Schaeffer told me to go to Wheaton, like while we were standing on the Liberty campus and sitting in the back of Jerry Falwell's car. He said, "Are you going to come here?" And I said, "Well, I just got into Wheaton." He goes, and I said, "But they don't like you at Wheaton," because he'd been in Time magazine, Francis Schaeffer, and Art Holmes kind of was jabbing Schaeffer a little bit. And he said, "Well, I think I'd go to Wheaton." So I went to Wheaton. And in my senior year, when everybody else had graduated, Schaefer got to come to Wheaton with Edith, and I have a picture of them on the Edmund stage. But in that process of taking that year off, Ken Myers called me and said, would you be interested in a writing job working for Chuck Colson? I was like, I promised my parents I would go back and finish my senior year. But I also knew right away, it's like as much as I would have wanted that job, that it was Michael's job. Like I knew right then. And so I said, no, I would, but I think my roommate is the one. And as Pete mentioned, then sent over the columns that Michael had written in the Record, including the one on Mother Teresa. And then I drove Michael at some point to Ken's house. Ken had left NPR. He was the editor of Eternity magazine, and we went to his house in Philadelphia where he was studying at Westminster. And then that led to the passing that on to Chuck. And Chuck, I'm going to tell you all the inane data around this stuff, because you may like, this may not care, but it's fascinating. So Chuck printed this out, and Chris reminded me of this, where it didn't have his name on it, and then he passed it, or maybe I don't know if you did or Ken Myers did, they passed it around to the office and to advisors and said, what do you think of this? And everybody thought that Chuck wrote it. But it was college student Mike Gerson that wrote it. And so that led to Mike getting the job at Prison Fellowship. And that was, I should have just stopped my career right there. Like in terms of like anything I did good for the world, it was all downhill from there.
So you peaked at age 20 then?
Yeah, exactly, that was it.
Okay.
He never read me anything aloud.
No.
Because he was a shrewd judge of character. He knew I would have stolen it. It's a Washington Post, New York Times thing.
Well, and usually, that's true, and usually he was also then asking me to write jokes. And to Pete's point and your point, the joke he loved the most, I didn't even actually write. It was the oldest, corniest evangelical joke you could use, but he used it everywhere. Which, when he would talk about this sort of conservative campus and all the rules, and that Wheaton was opposed to premarital sex because it could lead to dancing, and he probably told that joke 100 times.
Also about the pen chewing, because I'm a pen chewer. If you look at this pen, this is what I do every day. One thing that was unique about him, what is pen chewing about? It's about the marshaling of nervous energy.
Right, yeah.
And I think what was so striking about him, and I never saw him operate in the White House, but the ability to focus. Mm-hmm. And then to focus as a group is just a remarkable skill.
Yeah.
And I think his writing came out of that just intense focus.
No doubt. He had a tremendous capacity for that. And I mentioned this at dinner that it was a terrible obstacle for me, because Mike could then churn out like beautiful papers, and I was not good. Like I was struggling, and we were living in the apartment. I was working on the presidential campaign, and I'd come back and and he'd be like, "Can we go to a movie? Can we go to dinner?" He'd be done with his work, and and he would win. Like he had this yellow Mustang convertible, a '67. This was the hippest Mike Gerson ever got. Like, and his dad had given him this car. I don't know what you guys did to piss off your dad. But Mike got the yellow Mustang convertible, and so because he was able to focus and really churn out. But then he loved to just sit back and enjoy movies and talk about those things. But that intense focus characterized him, all the way through his life.
So when did you first find out he was a writer? Because you're a writer. You're an acknowledged writer. You're a beautiful writer. Did you read his stuff, or did somebody tell you about him, or?
Yeah, that's funny, because I think I knew him as sort of a policy person first.
Okay.
And then when he joined the Bush campaign in '99, late '99 or 2000, then I knew he was a writer. And I was more on the McCain side of things.
Right.
And McCain had also, I would say, the top two political speechwriters of my lifetime were Mike and then this guy named Mark Salter, who wrote for McCain. And first thing I remember about them both is I invited both of them to my eldest kid's bar mitzvah. And because they were Christians and didn't know the rules, they showed up on time. And so I've got Mark and Mike sitting there in the synagogue. I'm like, you guys might want to come back. This takes a while to get going. But by then, by the Bush campaign, obviously, we knew. I mean, he had worked for U.S. News and other things, but by that campaign, you knew what a special writer he was.
Sure. Now,
and I would see him. I remember once at the convention that year. I forget where it was. He famously did not like to hear the speeches.
Right.
And I ran into him at the convention center in the restroom, and so he could avoid the convention. We had a long conversation in the restroom about libertarianism and its shortcomings. But I think by the time the Bush campaign came along, especially with those speeches, you were aware that here was a writer of some specialness.
so I noticed you didn't mention Ted Sorensen, who wrote for JFK. Was that because you were too young to have remembered JFK giving those speeches?
Thank you. I was not alive, but thank you. That was a beautiful speech, the inaugural. I think Mike and Mark were better. I mean, if you go back and read the Sorensen speech, well, I don't know, we don't need to talk about Ted Sorensen, but it had eloquence without grounding. And so it was like, we'll cure poverty, we'll end disease. Like, if you're going to reach for the heavens and not have reality in there, you can soar.
Right.
But it's much tougher to write a speech that is really rooted in the thing you're actually going to try to do, and then be as eloquent as Mike was able to be.
Well, and that was also a capacity. Anybody can write can be a great speechwriter for somebody who can give a great speech. It's a much different thing to be a great speechwriter for somebody who's not naturally a great speech giver. And I think that, and I remember Mike working I think he was at U.S. News when he took the job with the Bush campaign. And I believe that after the meeting, I remember Michael calling me and saying, I just came, George Bush came to talk with me and just told me, like, you're going to be my speechwriter. I want you to write my announcement speech. I want you to write my convention speech. I want you to write my first inaugural. Like, he went through, and it was like, so I was like, oh, okay. Like, it wasn't even really in doubt. But that capacity then to say, what is the way that I as a speechwriter can give language in a way that this person can deliver it, and so that it reflects them and it becomes them. And then there becomes that dance between the speaker and the speechwriter. There's a unique symbiosis there that I don't think is probably hard to concoct. I mean, I think it takes a special writer like Michael to know how to restrain it. He could have swung for the fences probably and had to restrain himself. And maybe that constraint was actually an empowering thing.
Yeah. And now I'm feeling guilty about dissing Ted Sorensen. The last time I did this is no lie. His wife was in the audience.
Yeah. Oh, no.
I just tweeted it while you were looking the other way.
But, there was a famous speechwriter named Mark Helprin, who was a very beautiful novelist who wrote for Bob Dole. And it sounded 0% like Bob Dole, unless he had gone into a medieval abbey and come out speaking Latin. It's a very odd relationship between Mike and Bush, because Bush had the spirit in him. And so it wasn't like an implant. It really was authentic to Bush, but not always in the language Bush used when you were in person with Bush.
How difficult is it to write a speech for somebody else? I mean, I think you can write a speech for yourself because that's you, that's your ideas, your voice, but it must be really difficult to capture the other person's essence in words and have that person repeat your words.
Yeah, I did it so many years for Obama. No, I'm kidding.
Cut the mic, please.
You have to remember, it's you're not writing just to please that person when you're a presidential speechwriter.
Right.
You're writing to please 4 million people who work in the administration on some level. And so Peggy Noonan, who wrote speeches for Reagan, called them the mice. And she wrote, I'm not going to try to do it, she put the text of the Gettysburg Address, and then this is what it would look like if it was run through the White House press writing shop. And it was like, roughly less than a century ago.
Right.
And for non-history majors, President Lincoln wrote his own speech.
That's true.
But I'm sure we all know that. Scott, you want to add something?
No.
Okay, so let's talk about you've obviously known him a long time. You've read a lot of his writings, books, speeches, magazine articles, op-ed pieces, you name it. Can you identify your favorite piece that Michael wrote?
Well, other than like when he would use my jokes.
Of course.
Those were always good. I think it wasn't any one particular speech or phrase. I think it was that Michael had that ability to, and I'm not sure what you would even call this. It was the subtle signals of language, right? That he could send in a half of a phrase or part of a word from a hymn. So without being like, I'm going to thump you with this moral message, right? I'm going to take my sledgehammer and try to power this through your head. He was going to give you a little echo or something that maybe when your grandmother took you to church or something that might have been on the coffee table, and that would stir something in you, right? And I think where those phrases would pop up, those were the most powerful to me. And certainly in the inaugural addresses, where he really had some beautiful work, I think. But that pattern was always my favorite. How he was going to slip in something really profound in a way that probably most of the people hearing it missed it.
I mean, I think of the soft bigotry of low expectations. I mean,
Sure.
That is burned in my skull.
It's certainly the most lasting phrase. I think the one that's most commonly used or referred to.
Yeah, I would say, Pete talked about that big Jesus piece. I think he was proudest of that, and Pete didn't mention it, but I can't remember the number of comments that piece generated, but thousands and thousands and thousands. And some of the popular pieces that people talked about at the service and talked about in general is a piece about dropping your son off at college, and there's a piece about dogs. Right. I would say, though, the National Cathedral speech after 9/11 would be because that was a moment when you needed a language that was prophetic, had some grandeur to it, and could meet the depth and bigness of the moment. And we're very fortunate to have Mike at that moment. Right. Because it would have been so easy to hit the wrong note, or really not to rise to the spiritual occasion. And frankly, I'm not sure a secular writer, with very rare exceptions, could have done that.
And you had stated earlier, his speeches were grounded in his Christian faith, grounded in God's word. And that was certainly an example of that. How did you find out he was a practicing Christian?
It's a good question. He showed me the funny underwear.
That's the folks in Utah.
We're supposed to talk about that.
I think it was just part of him. I guess I have one memory. I went up to Philadelphia with him, and Dawn may have been there to a U2 concert. And I think it was, and I like rock. I used to go to U2, and some friends brought us up and we had a little meeting before the concert. Turned out U2 was Christian. I was like, what? I had no idea. And then I think it was the one concert. I think it was Mike's first concert, and I can't remember where it was. Somebody will know. And
he was shocked.
And we were standing in the back where all of the U2 family and friends were, and Bono says, I'd like to dedicate this next, no, it must not have been that concert, it must have been a later concert. I'd like to dedicate this next song to Michael Gerson.
Whoa.
And I think it was a song called Miracle Drug. And I whispered to Michael, this doesn't happen every time.
No.
Somehow, it was just so inherent in who he was. And I will say, I've known Pete equally as well. The friendship between the two of them is one of the most beautiful friendships I've ever witnessed. They wrote together, they were on the phone together, they prayed together. It was really a depth of relationship that was just so glowing and such a beauty to behold. And I think the faith was so central to both of them. I'm not sure I ever learned that they were Christian, just sort of, was radiated out, was a piece of who both of them are.
Yeah, it's something I mentioned at the memorial at the National Cathedral that even having been Michael's friend over 40 years, there were different worlds there. And I kind of said with sincerity to most of the people there at that memorial were from the inside the Beltway, sort of group that knew Michael. And I grew up in the DC area, but had lived most of my life outside. I escaped. And I said I was and am jealous. And I remember over time, because it was like, I was talking to Michael every couple of days or once a week, and mainly me calling, because Michael was not a great connector of people necessarily. I think he would admit to that. I used to tease him about it. But there was an ability of cadence when you're just proximate and you're there and you're able to develop that kind of relationship. And I think it's an interesting thing to me, and I know you've written about some of these themes. I'll be interested to see the things that you're writing in the future about the nature of friendship and Christian friendship and how we think about those things across our lives. Because Michael was a great friend, not always an easy person to be a friend of in some ways, but certainly that was profound. What I am bitter about is that I went to a couple of U2 concerts that Michael arranged, and there was only one window for me to actually meet Bono. And I had my kids, I was a single dad at the time, and I had my 2 sons and my now oldest daughter, who graduated here in 2017. She was probably 5, 6 at the time. And my sons were eager to see the opening act, which was Damian Marley, Bob Marley's son. And they were like, "Dad, can you just take us?" We're in this back waiting area, and Bono was going to come. Bono's going to come. Like, okay. And I say to this other friend, "Can you watch Emma?" And as soon as I left, Bono came in, picked up Emma, took all these pictures, and then left. And then I got nothing. So I never did get to meet Bono.
So, Scott, you obviously knew he was a Christian because you were at Wheaton College.
Yeah.
You were a Christian. Did you ever argue about any theological points?
I don't know that we did. I think it's actually an interesting thing, and I'd be interested in, his older brother is a pastor, but Pete and I have talked about this, that there was something very open about Michael's faith, but also very reserved. The closer you got to personal, and I don't know that there was, I think I'm rewriting family history. Michael's father died fairly young. His mother was, I thought, very open and emotional and effusive, great artist, a painter. But Michael was very quiet, I thought, about his personal faith. We would discuss certain things, around. We were both attending Anglican churches. Sometimes Michael would be interested in Catholicism, or he'd be, really got to obviously feel a spiritual home at the National Cathedral. And so we would talk around the periphery of some of those things, but there were never any major disagreements.
Okay. So what I've heard so far tonight is very serious, very studious, very grounded. But what about humor? Can you think of any humorous stories you can share?
That I can share.
That you can share.
Well, let me start with a serious point, and then we'll see where this goes. So in this year that we lived in this apartment, down in college apartments, I was working on this Reagan campaign, and on election day, I got a call from a mentor in Washington who said, "Can you go to Grenada, the island of Grenada, where they're going to have an election a year after the military intervention had taken place?" And I said, "Okay, when?" And he said, "Tomorrow." And I was like, and I ended up getting 2 more days. So I get all this together that I'm going to go down, and I was a good campaign organizer. And we had organized, 10,000 new college voters in Illinois that year. It was the most successful youth campaign in the country for Reagan in '84, which was not a hard job, really, as popular as Reagan was then. But there was a little bit of tension about this trip. And so I'd been prepped in this group that was running the short history lesson, but it comes back, you'll see. There had been a guy who was running Grenada. It's a little bit crazy, but like the U.S., really thought when he would say, "As I walk around our beautiful island," he meant it, that he thought he would tell people he could walk on the water around the island and communicate with aliens and whatnot. And he gets kicked out by communist insurgents in Grenada. A year later, there's this bloody demolition, and there's an invasion, and a serious, conflict. American soldiers died, and but now you've come in, and there's going to be an election. It's the first sort of election in a formerly communist country. You can debate about Chile, but there's some stakes here, and lots of players are looking at this because the communists are going to run again. The party of the guy that got kicked out, they're going to run again. But then there's a new party, which they call the New Party, and they are running a slate of 15 candidates, but they don't know how to do politics. So get a couple of young political types like me. Let's send them down to help. So we show up with all kinds of stuff. But I'm told some people don't want you here. Not all of the Cuban weapons have been accounted for. There are people in government positions around the island that were there because of the Communist Party. So just be very careful what you say and who you say it to. And here's your contact at the embassy. The embassy. It's like, okay. So I land at the airport, and the first thing is I'm at customs by myself. And this very gruff man is saying, purpose of your visit. Tourism? And now no tourists are in Grenada a year after this military intervention. And I've got I have a mimeograph machine to make pamphlets and stuff like that. And he's like, I was like, I write about tourism. I'm working on a book. I was going with anything. And he's like, pushes me through. I get to this hotel, this gorgeous hotel on the beach. Nobody's there because there's been a war. And the next day, I get a call from the front desk. There's a telegram for you. Okay, no cell phones, all of that. So I go down the beach, and I get this telegram, and I'm reading it as I walk back toward this hut, beautiful hut. And it says, "Dear Mr. Baker, welcome to Grenada. We hope you enjoy your visit to our scenic island. We trust that you truly are only a tourist." I go in, I shut the door, I close the curtains, I get down on the floor, I use the phone there to call this person at the embassy. This guy comes over, his card says he works for the Defense Department. And I said, he's like, just lay low, stay here. I was like, so I just stay in this darkened room for like all day. And he comes back that night and he says, I think I have sorted this out. I have traced this Western Union telegram from Grenada to Martinique to Chicago to the campus of Wheaton College, where Mike Gerson thought it would be funny to send me threatening telegrams.
So in other words, you got pranked.
So yeah, Mike could rise to the occasion.
So David, any stories that can top that?
I can't compete with that one.
Did he ever talk about Wheaton College to you, David, about his experience here?
Not in anecdotal detail, but more pervasive. He knew my wife went to Wheaton, so we would talk about that. In fact, I think I'm fair to say that Anne came to Washington inspired by Mike. Oh. And so I probably wouldn't have met my wife if Mike had not inspired her to come to Washington. And so I told him that at our last meeting in the hospital that, he indirectly gave me this great gift, so thank you. But I thought he personified Wheaton in every way. Mm-hmm. And, I've now been to many Christian colleges, and I've suffered through many wineless dinners at Christian colleges. But I do think among the ones I've visited, the 20 or 30 say Wheaton is unique. In part because of how it was founded and the abolitionist roots of it, in part because of the all truth is God's truth, in part just because of the intellectual seriousness and the applied spiritual seriousness, in part because forgive my critique of a decade-old Christian, but a lot of my views, a lot of the failures of the evangelical community come from a mixture of a spiritual superiority complex combined with an intellectual inferiority complex. And I would say Wheaton and Michael had neither of those. And so I do think of him as sort of, if you're a faculty member here, an administrator here, you can look at Michael and say, yeah, that's what we helped produce. And so I do think he embodied the school, and as I've come to know it, in so many ways.
I think that's a mic drop moment, but yeah, that's really profound. Scott, anything else to add about when you would see him and after you graduated? I'm sure you came to some reunions.
Yeah.
Did you have talked about the good old days, or was he looking forward?
Well, I think coming to a reunion would not have been like Michael's sort of natural idea of a great time. But I do remember us coming to one reunion together. Don, I do not believe you were on this trip, Don, and we had a great time. And then it's not the kind of thing we did every year, so it was like the next 5 years or whatever it was up. And so I came, and everybody's like, "Where's Michael?" I was like, "Well, I'm here." And I said, "Oh, he was planning to come, but he's in northern India and the border of Nepal." And they were like, "What's he doing there?" I was like, He's at the Dalai Lama's house," which was true. And so that's a good reason to skip a Wheaton reunion. But one of the great things I certainly have felt the same ethos that you've sensed here, and the same thing that sort of undergirded Mike's work and life that came out of the time that we had here, viscerally contributed to by many of the people in this room. And it was so great to catch up with Marilee, kind of wrapping up her 35 years of service here. And just thinking about all of the lifetimes of work and investment that go into young people, and never knowing where that will live and play out, right? You just don't know, where that will ultimately result. And we talked about it a lot. And it's very hard to duplicate a place like Wheaton. I've been fortunate. I live in Pittsburgh, and we have an organization in Pittsburgh called the Coalition for Christian Outreach, which operates kind of in the Pittsburgh area, so it's not nationally that well known. But we have my wife was on the board for 13 or 14 years, and we have a fabulous conference for college students every February called Jubilee. And it is, you can ask many Christian speakers, the best college conference that happens anywhere in the country. David Kinnaman, others will be like, "This is the only one. Don't tell anybody else, because this is the one to go to." And so I was able to spend many years being like, well, this is who you should book next, right? And I would give them a list of people to have come. And so many Wheaton people have been able to come and speak at Jubilee. But I always say that Jubilee was kind of the closest thing that you could be to coming to Wheaton, right? To being the experience of being on campus, where all truth is God's truth. And we're going to take that idea seriously and then explore what it looks like to live that out academically, professionally, and then just sing and worship like crazy. And so even when my oldest daughter was here for her term, I always came back, and people would be like, "Is Wheaton the same?" And I would sneak into chapel and other events, and I would be like, "I think these kids are so much better than we were." Yeah. I just sensed such a great heart in this place, and it's been a couple of years since I've been back. And so that's to me the wonderful thing about Wheaton, is that even as time has changed and the place has changed, that the spirit and the values and the mission, hasn't changed.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. So David,
and by the way, Michael would come and speak at Jubilee, and he was always one of the most popular speakers at Jubilee. But that was my selfish way of just getting him out of Washington to come to Pittsburgh to speak, and then we would go and have fun.
Clearly, Scripture influenced Michael's writing. Can you identify anything else that, like a specific writer that may have influenced how he wrote?
Well, he did stalk George F. Will.
Literally.
Literally.
Do you know that story?
You know better than I. Go ahead.
I want to hear how did he describe it, and then I'll tell you what really happened.
He just described Star, though I don't know the details. You may know the details.
I think we literally just we tracked down where his house was. Like, we were still in college, I think. I don't even think we were out of college. And we drove to his house in Chevy Chase, and we just went in. We went up to knocked on the door. He answered the door. We invited ourselves in, and in we went. And I did it as pretense that we were trying. I basically said, we'd like to publish your column in our college newspaper. Great move. And he's like, well, come in. And so we literally went to his house and just, so you should try this with David Brooks, many of you students.
Ooh. We have tasers now.
Anybody besides George?
He was finishing this book, or was writing this book on the Protestant tradition. So I think, the heavyweights of that tradition, and I don't know if it's fair to say here, but Catholic social teaching was also, I would say, a big influence. And, at the end, the health challenges were so severe. I do think, and he and Pete would talk about the book of Job.
Oh, yeah.
Mike would say that, Job asked for an answer, and God is not going to insult him by trying to give an answer. He's just going to say, I see you and I love you.
Right.
And so I think that, though, especially as those challenges became so strong, I think for some reason, that book particularly leaps to mind as something that one would, as if you were Mike in those circumstances, you would have thought about that.
Yeah, I took a picture in the hospital room of the 4 books that he had on the nightstand. And I don't know if he was actively reading them, but there was a book of Common Prayer, one of Meister Eckhart's books, and there was another anthology, and then Bono's book. And it was a paid placement, I'm sure. But in those moments, I think I told a little piece of the story at the cathedral, but I'll just give you a little better scene set of it. Just because I would drive down 4 hours from Pittsburgh and I saw him in September before he died at his house in Georgetown, where it was just hard for him to get around, and you kind of knew, and he was always struggling for so long. Like you forget, and maybe you didn't remember from the obituaries and that. He had a heart attack when he was in the White House when he was, I think, not even maybe 40, maybe still in his 30s, and then kidney cancer, and then all kinds of problems with pain from the surgery from that, and this would also come to play, by the way, into some of the humor. He really liked gallows humor to a degree, and so I just tried, in whatever role I played, was to be like deeply empathetic, but then merciless, just in making fun of whatever the point of suffering was. And he would sometimes text, he would have to dial down medication to go on television, just so that he wouldn't, he'd be coherent enough. And so he texted me once. He was like, I'm about to go on MSNBC with Andrea Mitchell, but I couldn't take my medication. This could be good television. Which is saying a lot, because as David unkindly reminded me at dinner, there is video of me on YouTube passing out on live television. You can look that up. But in that suffering, and he obviously talked about the cancer and wrote about the cancer. He talked about depression, wrote about depression, and if his famous sermon that he gave at the cathedral in 2019. But for the years of even suffering with Parkinson's, never really publicly addressed that. And at one point, maybe a year and a half ago, he said, do you think that I should talk about it? And I never wanted to be directive. I said, well, I think there could be some reasons to do it. And we kind of structured out what a talk would look like. And he really just wanted to have the jokes first. So I wrote a bunch of really awful jokes. And then, because that was a way, we were always being self-effacing, right? And just, sort of, but he never did, like, to the end. But if you were thinking about somebody who had heart attacks and cancer and surgery and pain and Parkinson's and depression and then more cancer and more cancer and more cancer, and who never was bitter, never complained, would talk about the struggle, that was remarkable over many, many years that he did not. But it was hard in the last year, you could just tell, and I'm sure it was hardest most on his family and his sons, that you know, he had one last lap to finish, and that last article was a part of that. And as I said in my eulogy, it's like, I already missed the words that won't be written.
So it sounds like you're describing a really resilient person. And my next question is, how do you view his strengths? What do you think some of his most prominent strengths were, David?
Yeah, well, I think we've summarized them. He had
We don't need more. Come on.
depth of vision, faithfulness, courage. Always, he would make the hard stand in a meeting. It's very hard to sit in the Oval Office and disagree with the president.
Right.
That's super hard. And I think he was capable of that. And then we haven't talked enough about that Depression speech at the cathedral.
You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I really recommend going on YouTube and just do Michael Gerson National Cathedral. And he opens by saying, I was originally scheduled to give this speech on whatever day, and he said it would have been a short sermon because I was at a mental health institution. And then I had a friend who at the same time was suffering from depression, and I had no idea what to say to my friend. And the only good thing I did in the 3 years my friend was suffering from depression was send him the video of Mike's sermon. And there's a line in there, I'm going to paraphrase it, that depression is a deformity in the machine you use to perceive reality. I'm really not doing the words correctly. I'm not doing them justice. But every person I've known who suffered depression, that line hits home. And so the ability to name, and the ability to have the courage to go up and give that sermon, but then a lot of people can do that, the ability to name exactly what the disease, this very mysterious disease actually is. That comes out of not just, there are a lot of writers who are, I wrote a book on character a few years ago, and I filled them, I had a lot of people who, Dorothy Day and St. Augustine, these were obvious. The hardest role to fill, I wanted to find a writer with good character. It turned out to be really hard to find that person. And so I would say that depression sermon flowed out of a lifetime
Of character.
of doing some serious thinking and serious kind of service in public through words.
You ever consider writing a book called Profiles in Character?
No, it wouldn't sell.
But after you watch that YouTube video of that sermon, then search and read David's column recently. It was in the months after Michael died, about your friend and about that, which is equally as profound.
What would you say his greatest legacy is? I mean, you knew him for over 40 years, Scott.
I would say you could see it in Anne. I would say it was because it's easy to say 25 million lives saved and all that. I think it's the inspiration that he gave to so many young committed Christians that you could do something really great in the world, and you could use your talents and
I'm going to get a little political here, but Mike stood for a vision of the Republican Party that was rooted in the birth of the Republican Party. And he spent his whole life fighting for that vision of this party. And I think when he died, it probably seemed that vision was very far away to him. But I don't think that's it forever.
Right.
And I think there will be some rediscovery of the Republican Party that Mike really tried to build.
Yeah, I think there will be a lot to unpack politically, academically, when you look back at the arc of the things that Mike was involved in, both in like what did and didn't happen with compassionate conservatism, decisions around what happened during the Bush administration, but all of the work that he did after the White House will be equally important in the way that he tried to kind of point a different kind of vision. I have one story that I have no other place. It doesn't fit exactly this question, but this is the only place to tell this story, and I don't think I've ever told it live before. And Michael is a player in this story, but not the main player. And it is this. So this is the story about how Scott Baker saved Western civilization. So after 9/11, and we come to a point where it's, what is the United States going to do, right? From the moment George Bush stood on top of the rubble and said they're going to hear from all of us soon, like what is that going to be? And it was an unusual time. Michael was not traveling with the president on 9/11, and I believe he was at home and started to head into the White House when the plane hit the Pentagon, saw the plane coming over. Similar for me, I was immediately, I was the evening anchor, but I was immediately headed to my station when Flight 93 was passing over Pittsburgh. And and so it was hard to communicate. And I think, in fact, Michael, Bush's first statements, didn't need to be eloquent, but Michael was not part of those initial statements because he wasn't with the president at that moment. But as we were waiting then over the coming months, I'm in the newsroom in Pittsburgh, and I do the 6 o'clock news. I go back to my desk, and I had my laptop, and on the laptop it had the Drudge Report. Now, years later, I'd actually worked with Matt Drudge and for many years, but it says on the top of the Drudge Report at 6:31, Oval Office, President Bush, 9 o'clock tonight, and I was like, huh. And I called Mike, and he answered, which was a little bit unusual. And I said, Michael, and he was hushed. He said, I'm sitting outside of the Oval Office. Can I call you back? And I said, is that because of the Oval Office address tonight? And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, on the Drudge Report right now, it says that President Bush is giving an Oval Office address tonight at 9 o'clock. It's a long pause. And Michael says, he names a person, obviously is sitting next to him. I don't want to indict that person because I don't know exactly their role. And he says, so-and-so, the Drudge Report right now says that President Bush is giving an Oval Office address tonight at 9 o'clock. And I hear an audible scream. And Michael hangs up, doesn't even say goodbye. So I walk down the hallway to our news director's office, right? Now, I've worked in network television. I worked at CBS after I got out of Wheaton. But I like working in local television when I did that. And I say to the news director, the war's going to start tonight. And he's like, what are you talking about? And I was like, I'm just telling you, the war's going to start tonight. He goes, we actually just heard all the networks, because everybody was on standby every night, like was something going to happen. And the White House press corps had been dismissed. Everybody had been sent home already. And I said, well, call ABC, we were at ABC affiliate, and tell them that they're wrong, that the war is going to start tonight. And he's like, oh yeah, I'm a local news director in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I was like, no, you can tell them. I said, in fact, you need to tell everybody on our team to staff up tonight. And he's like, what are you talking about? And I said, just trust me. The war is going to start tonight. Well, I walk back to my desk, it's 60 seconds later, and the story is off the Drudge Report. And that night, there was an Oval Office address, and President Bush announced the beginning of the military actions. And that moment of the oddity of somebody in the administration had been in process of trying to clue in to get, and the waning of Drudge is its own sort of epic that we can talk about, or the influence of Drudge over the years in different manifestations, but was very influential at that moment. But it was only up for like 60 seconds. But if it had stayed up for even a couple of minutes, would this have been a signal? Like now you're talking about a 2.5 hour, 3 hour gap between a tell to the world about what might happen and when that's actually announced, which can be an entirely different outcome in terms of what would happen. But because I had Mike's cell phone number, right? And in that little moment when I see this, I said, Michael, what's going on? And then that came down. I have no other conclusion about that story other than that happened. And I just wanted you to know it. You're here to hear that story.
I only have two more questions. One's an easy one and one's a hard one. So I'll start off with David. The easy question, or the hard question, is can you describe Michael in one word? And the easy question is there anything I should have asked you about Michael that I did not ask you?
Wait, which one was the easy one? I mean, the obvious one is faithful, but I'm going to say earnest. Michael was earnest, in a good way. Not pompous, but he was earnest and earnestly believing in his mission. And no, I can't think of anything you haven't asked me.
And I just want to comment on your earnestness because my colleague Michael McCoy's in the audience, and I asked him, because he went to some hoity-toity schools back east, and we started on the same day, July 1st, 2014. I asked him, can you describe the average Wheaton College student? He said yes, earnest and sincere.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Thank you for that.
I will say when I'm on book tour, I'll occasionally get a question that's really morally earnest. And I'll say, did you happen to go to Wheaton College? I got about a 60% accurate hit rate.
It's pretty good. Scott?
You know, I think I'm just going to say earnest. I'm going to go with that. I think the other factors around Michael's personality, around the intensity and the passion and the righteous indignation, all of those things are true, but earnest is probably really sufficient.
Well, I want to thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
Can I tell you one final little story?
Too late.
I can. I don't have to.
Please.
It's the conversation I had with him a week before he died.
Oh, my.
So I had gone down to the hospital, and Dawn knew that I was coming, and I think she was in a waiting area with Bucky and Nick, but we missed each other, and I ended up just going into the room by myself, and Michael was sleeping, and I just sat there for a good while, and at some point the nurse came in and nudged him. He didn't really stir that much, and then she left, and then he kind of opened his eyes, realized I was there, and then kind of pulled himself up, and then and he said, I've been given a really special privilege. This was not what I was expecting him to say. And I leaned over and I said, hi, Michael, what privilege are we talking about? And his eyes opened very brightly. And I said at the cathedral, just part of the story, and I said, I am sure that there are people that can tell me some scientific reason or medication reason or the nature of disease and the nature of the brain, and that I don't believe any of it. I believe what happened in that moment was what happened in that moment, exactly like it happened. And he said, a being came to me, a woman, I think, and said that I no longer have to be a being oriented towards physical objects. And I said, what do you mean by that? Is that? And I used the Celtic the phrase. Are you talking about thin places? Places where, are you in a place where heaven and earth are touching? And he said, yes, it's exactly that. And then he closed his eyes. And so that, and when I came back the following week, and it was just a few hours before he passed away, he wasn't really able to speak. I think maybe he did earlier in the day with family. He did open his eyes, but that was the last thing that he was really, able to say. A little bit later, a couple of other things. But that moment of Michael, that for me, feeling that moment where for all of the suffering and all that he had endured, there was this moment for him where there was such a brightness of, there is this transition to another place, and to be so excited about it, that will be something that I'll remember forever.
That's beautiful. I think on that note, let's thank our guests for coming over.